Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleague from Arizona for working so closely. This does not have to be a partisan issue. In fact, it should not be a partisan issue. My sense is in this Congress, in both houses, 80+% of the members believe strongly that the United States should be engaged in military action under some circumstances against this horrible threat of ISIL. And yet, despite that overwhelming consensus, and despite the clear constitutional command in Article 1 that we should not be at war without a vote of Congress, there's been a strange conspiracy of silence about this in the legislative branch for the last 16 months. The Senator from Arizona and I introduced a resolution in January to authorize military force, building upon previous efforts in the Foreign Relations Committee. The President submitted authorization. We did it knowing it's not perfect, knowing that not everyone would agree with every word, but we did it to show that we can be bipartisan and stand up against a threat like ISIL. And let's just review, as the Senator did, let's review what has happened since August 8th, 2014. The President on that day started airstrikes against ISIL and said he was doing it for two reasons. First, to protect American personnel who were jeopardized at a consulate in Erbil, and second, to provide humanitarian support for members of a minority religious sect, the Yazidis, who were basically being hemmed in by ISIL in Sinjar in northern Iraq. Those were the two reasons. At that point, in August of 2014, ISIL and their activities were limited to Iraq and Syria. 16 months later, we've lost 4 American hostages who have been executed by ISIL. We've lost 10 American servicemen and women who were deployed to that theater. We have about 3,600 American troops who are deployed thousands of miles from home, risking their lives every day. We've spent $5 billion, $11 million a day in the battle against ISIL. We've flown nearly 6,300 airstrikes with American aircraft against ISIL. ISIL, which was at first limited to Iraq and Syria, now has presence in Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia. They've undertaken attacks that they claim credit for in the Sinai in Egypt and in Lebanon. This threat is mutating and growing, and at the end of last week, on Friday the 13th, we saw the horror of ISIL with the grim assassination of innocents as they were enjoying dinner or going to music concerts or watching soccer games in Paris. ISIL put out a video a few days ago threatening similar attacks on Washington. ISIL's not going away. This is a threat, and the President started military action for a narrow and limited reason, but the threat has mutated. Like a cancer, it's grown, and it is now affecting nations all over the world. And so the question is, how long will Congress continue to be silent about this? Congress, and I will say, I think this is a malady that you can lay at the feet of both parties in both houses. Congress has seemed to prefer a strategy of criticize what the President's doing, and look, I'm critical of some of the things that the President's doing. The Senator from Arizona, the senior senator's speech early, laid out some challenges with the strategy. But it's not enough for this body that has a constitutional authority in matters of war to just criticize the Commander-in-Chief. But what we've done is sat on the sidelines and criticized, but we have not been willing either to vote to authorize what's going on, vote to stop what's going on, or vote to refine or revise what's going on. It's easy to be a critic. It's easy to sit in the stands and watch a play and say, well, why didn't the coach call a different play? But we're not fans here. We're the owners of the team. We are the Article 1 branch, and we're not supposed to be at war without a vote of Congress. I will hand it back to my colleague from Arizona, and then perhaps I could say a few concluding words that would be more about the kind of emotional rather than the legal side of this as we're thinking about the challenges in Paris. But I think the events of last week, Egypt, Beirut, Paris, demonstrate that the voice of Congress is needed. The voice of Congress is needed to fulfill our Article 1 responsibility. The voice of Congress is needed, as the Senator from Arizona mentioned, because we send a message by our voice to our allies, to the adversary, and to our troops. The voice of Congress is also needed because it has a effect of solving some of the problems that Senator McCain mentioned earlier. To the extent that the administration's strategy is not what we would want it to be, they have to present a strategy to Congress. And then we ask tough questions of the witnesses, and we refine it, and it gets better. And we do that all in the view of the American public, so they can be educated about what's at stake. When you don't have the debate, you don't put before the American public the reasons for the involvement, and that is desperately needed. With that, I want to thank again my colleague from Arizona. I'd like to say a few words at the end about why this is a matter of emotional significance to me, but I would now defer to my colleague. Thank you again to the senator from Arizona for joining together in this important area. So I had an epiphany that was kind of a sad epiphany on Friday as I was thinking about this, and I think about Senator Flake and I have children that are about the same age, and I was thinking about young people, looking at our pages here, I was thinking about young people. Like many, when the attacks happened Friday, my first thoughts were to, who do I know in Paris? And a lot of folks have relatives or have family or coworkers or former coworkers that were in Paris, and like a lot of people, I got on the phone and I got on the text to try to track down my niece. I have a niece who is a student at law school, third-year law student. She's in Paris for a semester, studying at the Sciences Po. And she was in the restaurant area where the shootings occurred, so close that she could hear them. She was not immediately affected, but she and her friends had to kind of barricade themselves in the restaurant for a while, wondering what was going on. Now, we were able to determine that Elizabeth was fine. And she assured all the family and, the people who wanted to send her the plane ticket to come home, no, I'm fine. But I started to think about over the weekend, like how fine she really was, how fine our young people really are. Because Elizabeth was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon a few years ago. And since coming home, the village that she lived in was essentially wiped out by Boko Haram. The next door neighbor that was her protector and the protector of all the Peace Corps volunteers that came before was killed, along with a lot of her other friends. And Boko Haram has now pledged allegiance to ISIL. So she's had the experience of losing friends and a terrorist attack in Cameroon, and now she's had the experience of being nearby and hearing a terrorist attack in Paris. And it started to work on my conscience a little bit that this for now, for her, is a norm. For me, at age 57, these events are not the norm. They're the extreme. But for Elizabeth, or for my children, I have 3 kids, one in the military. They all came of age after 9/11. We're living in a world that for so many of our young people, the norm is not peace and safety and complacency. The norm is war or terrorist attacks all over the globe. And if that can be said about American young people, it's certainly the case for young people in France or young people in Syria or all over the region. I hate that we're living in a world where young people are starting to think that this is the norm rather than the exception. And it seems to me as an adult, as somebody in a leadership position, that part of what we need to do is rather than just allow us to drift without taking a position into the world where this is more and more normal, while acknowledging that we're humble people and we can't completely control all the destiny, we've got to take charge of a situation and not stand by and just lob in criticism, but try to shape it to the best of our ability. I think that was the genius of the drafters of the Constitution. James Madison, the Virginian, who drafted many of these provisions, was trying to do something incredibly radical. War at the time was for the king or the monarch or the emperor. And Madison and the others who drafted the American Constitution said, we're going to take that power to initiate war away from the executive. Nobody else has really done this. And we're going to put the power in the hands of the people's elected representatives so that they will debate and soberly analyze when you should take that step of authorizing military action, where even under the best of circumstances, horrible things can happen and people can lose their lives. Well, we've allowed this war to go on long enough without putting a congressional fingerprint on it. For our young people, for our troops, for our allies, for our adversaries, it's my prayer that we will now in Congress take up that leadership mantle and try to shape this mutating and growing threat to the greatest degree we can. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and thank again my colleague from Arizona.